Alright, so before I get into the actual review, I want to get something clear right off the bat. Yes, Genshin Impact is a Chinese game, and MiHoYo is a Chinese company. I just want to make it clear that while I'm about to perform a 30-minute fatality on this game, none of it has to do with the nation it comes from, and I'm not going to attack the game on that basis. For those of you who are wary of Chinese games, because most of the ones you know are from Tencent, MiHoYo actually chose not to be bought by Tencent a few years ago and to operate of their own accord. And for those of you who are wary of Chinese games because you think the Chinese are stealing your data, I'm just going to remind you that you're watching this video on a platform owned by Google. Trust me, there's plenty of shit to get into here, from the gameplay to the story to the writing to the gambling, plus the few other things that I actually want to give some positive attention to before it's dragged away by the screaming tentacled mass that is the rest of the game. So sit down, grab a drink, and watch the stupid cartoon cat put a free anime game through the wood chipper. Genshin Impact is a third-person action-adventure RPG light that released in 2020 and has become one of the bigger sleeper hits of the past year. Now, the people who don't know anything about Genshin are probably assuming that has something to do with a similarity to Breath of the Wild, so before I start talking about the game proper, I feel I should address the neither of these games have an elephant in them in the room. If you've only played Breath of the Wild, a cursory glance at this game's art direction, combat, and certain mechanics might give you the impression that Genshin is the crappy knockoff to Nintendo's take on open-world design. Putting aside the fact that these are both entries in the same genre as these, each of these elements actually do have a lot of differences, and I think it's best to start with the visuals because it's one of the only things Genshin does well. The art styles are kinda similar, yeah, and you know what's really crazy? Genshin is the better looking game in a lot of places. Breath of the Wild has a lot of beautiful locales, but Genshin has vistas that are not only amazing, but memorable. The windmills of Mondstadt, Liyue City, the mountain that constantly tries to kill you, there are great looking areas everywhere. However, before this starts to sound like praise, I'll put a qualifier on that point. Genshin Impact is the more visually appealing world, but Breath of the Wild is more mechanically engaging. The vistas of Genshin are just that, vistas. In Breath of the Wild, the world may not have as many places that stick out in my mind now, but in the moment, the gameplay systems created a world that felt far more alive. You could cut down trees, use that wood to build a campfire, throw food onto the campfire to cook it, then cry bitter, angry tears when the rain put out that campfire. In Genshin, you get this chest of boring loot in a cool area, or this identical chest with identical loot in a different area. To be fair on both games, I don't think either of these open worlds are used to their full capability, but Breath of the Wild does a lot more than placing collectible mint everywhere to make its world feel alive. That world isn't perfect though, and while the shrines are placed in areas that are sometimes pretty cool, the actual design of those shrines are I played this game a couple years ago, and the only ones I remember are the combat ones because I had to do them a dozen times. And yeah, I didn't replay the game for this review. This footage isn't mine. To anyone who thinks I should have used a capture card, I have no money or copy of the game right now, and to anyone who thinks I should have emulated, I tried, failed, and there's a special circle in hell for the people who made tutorials that don't explain how to install the f***ing games on this emulator. Now, I bring up the shrines because they're a large component of the gameplay, and Genshin has a version of these called domains. They're also very forgettable. The puzzles there aren't really any. Some of them have a bit more visual flair than Breath of the Wild ever did, but they have you doing a smaller variety of stuff than the dungeons in the game where the dungeons are a weak link. The majority of what you do in those dungeons is combat. Combat is another area in which Genshin differentiates itself from Breath of the Wild, notably by being worse. And that's a real disappointment, because Genshin has a fair bit of interesting ideas going for it that could make it significantly more fun than what Nintendo had to offer. Each character has their own weapon type and kit, and you can swap between 4 characters, meaning you're not only speccing a single character to be as effective as possible, but you're doing that as part of speccing a team to work together as efficiently as possible. Sounds cool, right? Well, I hope you're ready for disappointment, because the whole team cohesion thing has the density of wet paper, and the actual combat can be summarized by a line from SAO Abridged.
Whoa, gosh, we could, group up
and hit it till it dies!
Woo, nice! Yeah. High five!
Combat in Genshin Impact is simple, and let's use Protag Boy as an example. You have a 5-hit standard combo, a flurry attack that uses a bit of stamina, an elemental ability that recharges quickly, and an elemental ultimate that recharges slowly. That may sound like a fair amount, but that's also literally all you have. Even Breath of the Wild, which gives you fewer options unless you feel like killing a goblin with a Rube Goldberg machine, has more mechanical freedom with a single combo. You can jump strike. Do you have any idea how empty your moveset feels without a jump strike? And then the combat doubles down on being a game of rote button mashing by having the grace and flow of the Radio City Christmas Spectacular, except instead of dancing shoes, everyone is wearing concrete bricks, and instead of the Rockettes, it's me. Taking Protag as an example again, you have the basic combo and the charge attack and the elemental ability, and these are separate. This makes sense for the ultimate, but not for every type of attack. If you use the elemental ability mid-combo, you are interrupting that combo. If you start the combo midway through the elemental ability, you are an idiot. Use the charge attack mid-combo, you're ending that combo. The highest level of input complexity you can get here is replacing the final attack in the regular combo with the elemental ability or the flurry attack. You could call this the house in Secret of Arrietty for how low the skill ceiling is. Now, the Genshin fans in the audience, as well as anyone who doesn't have a -3 to intellect, will probably say that I'm not being fair to the game and that the other characters should be examined as well. But before we do that, I also want to talk about the enemy design, more specifically the world bosses. You don't need me to tell you that enemy design is extremely important when designing combat, as the way enemies behave and are placed within a combat are vital in directing how the player will use the tools they have to engage with said enemies words. To Genshin's credit, while the majority of common enemies are simplistic, they don't do much more than take your time. They're throwing sticks while you're wearing plate armor. They go a bit further than that though, and will sometimes have elemental abilities that will make things a bit more interesting, and can serve as a testing ground for giving and receiving elemental effects. With the boring shit out of the way, let's talk about bosses, and unfortunately for this video's tone, I actually like them. Asterisk goes here. There are several bosses you can walk up to and beat up for their lunch money, but half of them have visual designs so lazy there straight up isn't any. You've got the Regisvine, giant angry flowers, the Oceanid, a water spirit who evolves into crabs, and Beth, who is a cube. Guess who got copy-pasted several times. In practice though, they're actually pretty fun to fight. The Oceanid isn't particularly fun since a lot of it is just fighting a bunch of micro-bosses, but Beth and the Minecraft fan club have some attack patterns that make them a genuine, if minor given how padded your health is, challenge to defeat quickly. My personal favorite enemy are the Geo-Dragon things, because their attack pattern consists of going rock goblin on your ass until either you or it dies. They're so unrelenting that you have to be on your toes the entire time, and while getting stun-locked until your powerhouse dies can be unfair, your health is padded like a double-stuffed mattress and you can keep it up either with food or a shield ability. It's the one enemy I genuinely like fighting, from the lowest level version to dear lord is that a cumbersome title. Getting back on track, let's take a look at every other character you get in the first couple hours of the game. In a borderline deliberate attempt to undermine the point I just tried to make about characters being one note, the first character you get after Protag is Amber, who is an archer and therefore doesn't have to worry about combos at all. Her ability is to throw out a small plushie that draws enemy aggro and explodes when it takes enough damage, which is good since it allows you to focus on shooting things uninterrupted. Her ultimate is a ton of wasted potential though, as calling in a small airstrike of flaming arrows is kind of hard to use when it triggers 3 feet in front of you and enemies tend to leave it pretty quickly. I wouldn't call her a bad character, but she's a bit underwhelming. Kaya is another swordsman, but unlike Protag, and spoiler alert, basically every other character I'm going to talk about, he actually has some semblance of combat flow. The final attack of his standard combo involves him teleporting behind enemies to stab them, which feels like a deliberate strike on its own, but more importantly allows you to use his elemental ability. The ability is a pretty simple stab that does frost damage, but you can use it after the 4th attack and immediately follow with another combo, allowing you to chain together 10 hits relatively quickly. It's a long way off from what I think this game is capable of, but when everyone else is blasting a single note ad nauseum, I'll take whatever melody I can get. Speaking of one note, Lisa is a witch whose kit is designed to deal AoE lightning damage and nothing else. Her ability does AoE lightning damage. Her ultimate does AoE lightning damage, but more. Her basic attack combo does less damage than if she just threw her spellbook, but her charged attack can damage a group of enemies if they're close together. It feels like you're just supposed to swap to her for enough time to fire an AoE spell, then swap to someone else. Which brings me to the group mechanics. If the characters are so one note, but you use 4 of them in tandem, it balances out, right? Well, that's technically true, but MiHoYo seems to have gone for what's mechanically functional over what's actually interesting. The game goes for an elemental combination system, where combining elements creates status effects. Frost and Wet freeze enemies solid, combining fire or frost with Geo makes little buff crystals appear, and that's the list of interesting ones. Everything else is just some variation on do a lot more damage, to the point where the wind element is entirely built around the idea of using it with other elements for greater damage output and or setting yourself on fire. The intent here is to have you swapping between characters in order to quickly stack elemental effects, so min-maxing your damage output consists of swapping 4 characters instead of mastering a single kit with greater depth. Wait a minute, that actually sounds interesting. Well, allow me to elaborate on that. Is this mechanically interesting? Well, somewhat. It's not used to its full potential, but it works if you're a fan of taking an analytical, numbers-based approach to games. You fucking nerd. However, there's this thing that action games tend to do where getting better at the game makes your gameplay stylish as all hell. And herein lies the problem. Genshin could have combat that's stylish as all hell, but it doesn't. Wow, making your thesis halfway through your essay. Very intelligent. Friendly reminder that before you go talking shit about a game's flow, you should make sure that your own video doesn't reveal you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And I'd be inclined to agree with you if it weren't for the fact that almost every other small detail reveals that this game could go the Devil May Cry route without losing anything. The animations for the sword swings are dramatic, and the cutscenes have some really fun anime choreography, but in combat you're just doing the same 5 very nice looking animations in hour 1, 10, 100, and beyond. All that's changing is your damage output. And while some of the behind the scenes mechanics are a bit complex, what I'm actually doing is extremely shallow. I'll put it this way, if someone walks in on you playing Bayonetta really well, they'll see some insane balletic fight choreography. If someone walks in on you playing Genshin Impact really well, they'll see some really big numbers. And unless that cute girl who likes science fiction and threatening my life is there, I don't really feel like going to math club. Unfortunately for me, the teacher's holding me at gunpoint again, meaning it's time to double down on the nerd shit and talk about artifacts. Artifacts are a lot like armor pieces in other games like this. You've got 5 slots, 1 for each type, and each artifact has 3 stats. The main number, the inconsequential numbers, and the set bonuses that you only get if you use multiple pieces of a single artifact set. Now, this is the part where I'm legally required to admit that I myself am on some nerd shit, and this kind of customization should really appeal to me. There's a difference between meaningful customization and being told to fill out a math packet though, and Genshin is making me fill out a math packet on the bus to the field trip and calling me a little bitch when the motion sickness nearly makes me vomit.
The hell am I on about?
Problem 1. Getting better artifacts doesn't look like a significant change. This is one thing that I understand, as the character design wouldn't really gel well with all the added feathers, tiaras, and pocket watches. But to counter that, it's not like you're applying full armor. These are already items that aren't particularly intrusive, but why would you then go the extra step and make them not appear at all? Problem 2. Getting better artifacts doesn't feel like a significant change. Good loot should feel rewarding. Something like the Outriders demo does this really well. After only a couple hours of gameplay, you're already getting rare drops, and those rare drops have perks that make their use significantly more interesting. The heavy machine guns aren't for me, but slap a perk on one where the enemies you kill with it do blood explosions, and you've got something that'll at least make me reconsider. This is something that even the godfathers of the modern combat kleptomania experience haven't been able to pull off, so I wasn't expecting much from Genshin. But even with my soft spot for this kind of loot system, I feel like this is just so f***ing boring. It's all just stat changes. Even at the highest level of gear, you're just getting more numbers that are bigger. This isn't meaningful progression, this is accounting, and I don't even have completed taxes to show for it. The only thing that even remotely registers on the interesting scale is the bonuses you get by using multiple artifacts from a single set. This is something that has a lot of potential if you want to encourage the player to keep some uniformity in their setup, but this falls flat too because there's no visual reason to not mismatch your loadout, and the way the set bonuses are written makes my eyes glaze over. Upon obtaining a crystal created through geo-elemental reaction, all party members gain 35% resonance to that particular element for 10 seconds isn't a good description of an ability, it's a passage from a f***ing textbook. And just when you'd think, hey, maybe a textbook approach would be kinda useful, the game bursts in, eats the textbook, and leaves to watch Kirito get assaulted in a parking lot while Asuna gets assaulted in the internet. If you, like me, are wondering why I'm making multiple references to Sword Art Online, then allow me to explain the thought process I had one day while playing this game. So there's this channel called Mother's Basement, and he talks about anime. Back when I frequently watched anime, I saw a video of his where he talked about how, even if Sword Art Online was a real game, it would be the worst game of whatever year it was released in. One point he makes during the course of the video is that, as an MMO, the playstyles available would prevent most people from enjoying the game.
SAO has one player role, close range DPS. It has characters that it calls tanks, but the only difference between them and attackers is that they block enemy attacks instead of dodging them. So healers don't exist, and tanks don't do any of the aggro management that they're supposed to. But even DPS players get the shaft with this system. Having no supports means that every player has to constantly worry about their own life bar, which they can't even see half the time, chugging potion after potion just to stay alive, which would get boring fast for anyone who wants to take an aggressive DPS role in combat. It's antithetical to how they want to play.
Now, to say Genshin Impact has the same problem as SAO would be disingenuous. Every character doesn't fall into the exact same archetype. Most characters fall into a very similar archetype. You've got close-range DPS characters, which summarizes more than half the party, long-range DPS, several of which have some kind of distraction ability that makes shooting things easier, a couple characters who have abilities that you could consider tank-like, the spellcasters who serve as a kind of support role by doing elemental DPS, and Barbara, the only character whose kit is designed for healing instead of combat, and thus the only true support character. I'll give the game this. Every character looks fantastic, except the lollies who can all go eat glue, and the abilities lend some gameplay variety, but actually using them feels kinda samey. But that isn't something bad per se, just boring and underwhelming. We can go worse. We can go exponentially worse. And it's not even that hard to do. All you have to do is take a quick press of the F3 key and you'll open up the loot box menu. Now, maybe I shouldn't focus on this so much. Every outlet seems to talk about how the gacha system is optional or unintrusive in Genshin, and part of me sees what they're saying. But I can't do that. And I was never going to do that. If I'm going to fairly give critique to this game, I need to talk about the mechanic that butchers it. To start, the idea that it's optional is nonsense. It's there, and I can choose whether to participate in it, but I can't choose to remove it or its effects on the game. The arguments against loot boxes are long and detailed, and I'm not going to get into it here. Please watch James Stephanie Sterling. Moving on. One of the big ways monetization hurts games is by taking a sense of meaningful progression and putting it directly in front of a steamroller, because otherwise no one would buy them. Remember when I mentioned the dozens of identical chests with identical loot? Well, all that loot is incredibly boring. Common weapons, common artifacts, and upgrade materials, which strikes me as a little redundant since the first two serve only to be infused into items you actually care about. You don't get good loot from exploring. You get good loot by paying for random drops or by getting the special random drop currency at a slow rate to use in random drops. In typical free-to-play fashion, I'm simplifying the system quite a lot, as in reality you have to go through a veritable meth recipe of materials you have to pay for other materials, to pay for other materials, to get a chance at getting something. And even that oversimplifies things, because this system is far and away the most complicated mechanic in the entire game, which isn't even that uncommon. You've got cases and keys and upgrade materials and ascendant materials and currencies you have to buy and currencies you can't and currencies that don't have to do with the loot boxes but you have to buy anyway. I was going to make a joke about these systems being designed by 4X fans or phone companies, but the former seems to think they've got a good system and the phone companies probably have had their notes copied a few too many times. To complete the shit sandwich of loot box design, I also need to mention the actual drop rates for items because... Let's put this in context. The history of loot boxes as a mechanic go back several years, but most people point to Overwatch as the first game to really popularize them in the AAA space. Overwatch made bank, the loot boxes made bank, and the other ghouls saw that and took notes. If you're trying to get the shirtless McCree legendary skin, provided the timed event is in place and artificial scarcity isn't pounding you into the dirt, you'll be trying to work with a legendary drop rate of 7.5%. Team Fortress 2 has a system so convoluted I'd need a research team and a grant to understand it, but some Googling told me that every loot box has a chance to give you an unusual hat, whatever that is. The chance is 1%. CSGO has an entire weapon skin market, where each crate has different drop rates for different things that fluctuate in value and can be bought-sold on the market. And if you think that sounds like a pointlessly complex, volatile, and arbitrary system, then I'd like you to stop looking at the 2008 financial crash section in your economy textbook and focus on the lesson at hand. While it's difficult to calculate the official drop rates for legendary weapons in CSGO crates, the general community consensus seems to be that the odds of getting a legendary weapon skin is 0.64%. The odds of getting a 5-star character in a seasonal drop in Genshin Impact is 0.6%. 0.6. That is a scam. The notion that any of these values are fair is nonsense, but 0.6 is sub 1%. I don't even know what to say about that. I'm genuinely speechless.
But what about...
No! I don't care about the pity system. You have to roll nearly 100 times to guarantee a 5-star drop in a system where one roll costs nearly $3. I don't care that CSGO knives have a lower drop rate, the permanent loot box has a similar rate, and even if it didn't, that wouldn't make these rates okay. I don't care that the 5-star pity on a seasonal drop gives a high chance of getting the banner character, because the 5 stars on the seasonal banners are constantly on a f***ing timer before they vanish for God knows how long. Just because you cleared the bar of not being part of Tencent doesn't mean that everything above that is fair game. Kneecapping progression to encourage use of a system that's convoluted, exploitative, and hostile isn't optional and unintrusive, it's systematic abuse of your player base, and it is f***ing vile! How's the story?
Kids are impressionable. That's why here at this station, we watch the programs and commercials your child watches carefully. He may see bad guys, but not in the role of heroes. And he'll learn that crime doesn't pay. Because your child's welfare is our concern, too. That's part of our code. The code of the National Association of Broadcasters.
Well, I've definitely already hit my emotional peak, but never let it be said that I'm not thorough. Except for the music, which I can't really go into depth about because I'm tone deaf, but I like it. It uses a variety of classical instruments, and unlike a standard orchestral soundtrack, it gives focus to more unique sounds. It's not like much I've heard in games, and it's really nice. I go up to a mountain somewhere, and I just feel calm. I get into a fight, and the music puts a smile on my face. But sadly, due to everything else, these feel less like high points and more like a look across the river and over the valley, with the cool breeze flowing by you and smelling like peaches, and leaving you entirely at peace before George takes his Luger and caps you in the head. The story in Genshin Impact is dull, poorly written, irritating, and still manages to make some bafflingly strange decisions. Now you, who I am portraying as a spooky monster in a stupid hat, are probably asking, well, what's the story, and expecting me to give some kind of coherent summary. However, that's surprisingly difficult for me to provide, since there are about 10 billion plotlines running simultaneously. The other issue is that it's ongoing, so I'm going to try and make sense of the summary, and keep in mind that what I say may be wrong because the story changed over time or because I'm stupid. Genshin Impact is set in this place called Tivat. Tivat has 7 city-states, and each worships a different god. Meanwhile, in the realm of floating castles, too clean for Sky Sanctuary, 2 siblings fight a god with Phantom Ruby powers. You pick which sibling to play as, the other one goes to null space, and you get vibe checked from the title screen dimension to the gameplay dimension, and the existential terror of the F3 dimension sends you into a coma for an unknown amount of time. After that, you wake up and go to find your sibling with your new friend Paimon, the most prominent member of the cast and who therefore has a hand in every bad thing about the story. As soon as you get to the city-state of Mondstadt, you find there's a small problem in the form of a very angsty dragon, and the plot to find your sibling is fired into the sun for a little while as the first major chunk of the game's plot revolves around this dragon, this Scooby Gang, and this femboy. And this is my first problem with the story. Your role in it is passive to a fault. The side quests actually do things marginally better than the main story in this regard. The Dark Knight Rises quest has some of the most painful, cringe-inducing writing I've ever read in my life, but you're an active participant in the quest, and you play a part in helping Batman accomplish a task he genuinely couldn't complete otherwise. It's bad, but not nothing. In contrast, the main plot consists of all the characters whose names can be spoken doing everything plot-relevant, while you essentially play the vessel for said characters. Despite being the only character with a long-term goal that's clearly set up in the plot, Protag Boy has the least character of anyone. Granted, I'll take Silent Protag over the snarky, too cool for school Protag other developers like to have in their live service games.
Get glitched.
But any irritation spared by the protagonist never opening their mouth is brought back by every other character opening theirs. The writing has 2 problems, terminology and everything else. Terminology is a problem because Genshin has a lot of it from the word go and expects you to keep up. Big cutscenes introduce new proper nouns to the player like an automatic rifle introduces bullets to skulls, and both leave your head feeling about the same. What makes this particularly difficult is that things aren't explained nearly as quickly as they're brought up. There's so many things to keep track of, and the game has no problems with you getting lost. And maybe I want to get lost, since being wherever I'm supposed to be means I have to listen to
money, health, love, but you will go for justice.
Whoa, check you out! When you speak like that, you actually make a pretty convincing Adept Eye messenger. People
Shut up!
in Mondstadt
Shut up!
hardly ever
Shut
come
up!
here.
Shut up!
This is the everything else. Dialogue is exceptionally childlike, but instead of filling me with a sense of joy and wonder, it makes me want to take a couple proper nouns to the head. There's the regular anime problem of no subtlety, meaning characters will take things that should be subtext and state it blatantly, but then there's the children's programming problem, where the characters will state things multiple times in the same cutscene. It drives me up the f***ing wall to hear characters mention a new thing, explain that thing like I'm 7, then hear it get explained again by the lolly incarnation of Jar Jar Binks, all the while calling attention to things I've never heard of. You might have picked up on how much I'm talking about the way the story is told, rather than the story itself. That's partly because the story is ongoing, and partly because nothing important is happening relative to the protag's sibling quest. The initial setup of protag looking for sibling is weak narratively, since it's like watching a brick look for another brick, but at least it's presented well. All that is instantly thrown under the bus by the story structure being a series of roadblocks on the path instead of a journey. It's like One Piece or Fallout 4, and neither of those are good things to be compared to. Want to have a strong narrative focus? Good, do that. Want to make a game that plays like an episodic series of adventures? Good, do that. I honestly think Genshin should have that kind of structure. The wacky adventures of the squad is perfectly fine for a setup, but the two just don't work well when combined. Now, hold on, I hear you saying again, wearing another stupid hat on top of the first one. An overarching plot consisting of many smaller adventures is extremely common for RPGs. Are you seriously going to critique Genshin on the basis of having an RPG plot? Shush. I actually did consider that. Here's the conclusion I reached. Let's look at Breath of the Wild. That game has an overarching plot where a variety of roadblocks present themselves. What Breath of the Wild does better is tie the minor adventures to the overall story. Taking down the divine beasts and helping the town are inextricably linked. Helping the town lets you take on the divine beasts, and taking on the divine beasts helps the town. It's an individual story, but your involvement in it directly furthers the main plot. You can also not bother with that dumb shit and kick boss fight in the face after an hour and a half. For a better example, let's half remember what you read of One Piece. Luffy has the overall goal of finding the One Piece, but each arc consists of its own isolated adventure. I hate One Piece for a lot of reasons, but one thing I don't hate is how this is handled. Luffy doesn't have to partake in these adventures, he chooses to. His actions also help him get stronger in the hopes of eventually killing Hitler or whatever and taking the One Piece. The overall plot is always there in the background, but it's not urgent. The characters can enjoy the journey and not look like they're ignoring the coming apocalypse. Genshin has the kind of overarching narrative Breath of the Wild has, but the things you do in the adventures aren't linked to the overall plot in any meaningful way. So far, the plot has been an exercise in looking for leads on your sibling, ending up in another adventure, doing the adventure, and then the god character of the region says, hey, maybe go that way to find them. Midnight Man Ex Machina provides a better lead to what the protagonist is looking for than literally anyone. This can be done right, but Genshin isn't doing that. Am I done? That tangent was long enough to have scene selection and bonus features. Ugh. Now where was I? Oh, right, the dialogue feels like I'm trying to bash my skull in with a kid-friendly mallet. Actually, hold on. Is the dialogue like that because they think I'm stupid, or because this is actually meant to be experienced by children? If it's the former, I guess the joke is on me for writing over 6,000 words about it, but if it's the latter, then that means Genshin knows it's meant for a younger audience, and then included all the monetization anyway. Best play it safe. Anyway, one other reason for why I've spent so much time critiquing the storytelling rather than the story is that it's still being told, and I want to circle back to that. Being a live service game, Genshin's been telling its story in parts. That makes it exceptionally difficult to talk about if you want to analyze it for any sort of themes or motifs or any other English Lit 101 shit. It's doubly difficult when themes have clearly presented themselves, but because the story is still under construction, I can't say much about it. With that being said, it's time to try anyway. Names and titles struck me as very important over my time playing Genshin Impact, because everyone has several and they're important to the plot. The Dark Knight Returns quest focuses on Batman Greatsword's titles, as well as his animosity towards the Neverwinter Guard, which I can't really critique because that arc isn't over. The main quest reveals that the femboy is actually the Wind God, and then goes on to do that again by revealing that Zhongli is also secretly a god. You know, aside from the way he already is. Names and titles are obviously a big part of Genshin Impact's storytelling, but what really bothers me is that I don't have any idea what it actually serves, so all I can really do is speculate. The repeated reveals in the main quests could be related to themes of perception, since it alters how you see the characters going forward. That'd be a pretty basic theme, but most mobile games that profitable can barely include that, so credit where credit's due, I guess. There's also a recurring bit in the Old Testament where people are tested by God, and he reveals himself after the person in question passes or fails. However, it'd be incredibly stupid of me to take a Chinese game and uncritically point to the Bible for my analysis, so I'll leave you with this. There's definitely some greater themes that this game is working on, but not only is it hard to analyze a fifth of a gacha game, but I'm also a moron who knows more about Sonic than symbolism. Which I guess brings me to the final question. And you say, no it doesn't, and I say, shut the hell up. Is Genshin Impact bad? Absolutely. And it f***ing hurts to have to say that because there's some good stuff here. Part of me is still happy for the game's success, because the idea of Tencent getting one-upped by a smaller company brings me a lot of anti-corporate glee. But I can't in good faith recommend Genshin Impact because the flaws drive a knife into the game and the loot boxes twist that knife like a spaghetti fork. Can't get enough of the visuals though. It's just such a pretty game. I don't get what's going on with gacha games, but they look so much more interesting these days. Genshin, Arknights. Good lord, Arknights. Who gave them the right to make a game with art direction and character design this good? Everything I've seen for this game looks so cool, and it's all for a tower defense game with a loot box system more confusing than Genshin. Anyway, Genshin's been on my mind a lot lately, if you couldn't tell. I really just had to talk about it. And I don't like it. It's bad. Don't play it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you all have enjoyed the show.